Hello, everyone. Thank you for spending part of your Thursday morning with us, and welcome to our next installment of the series on emerging technology in federal government. Today, we're going to be talking about optimizing your SIM. We'll focus on the following topics. The first is cost, near and dear to everyone's heart, getting the maximum value from your logs and SIM within your budget. Um, Reduce your risk, keep the data you need, and also get it when you need it. Flexibility, expand the capabilities of making the data by making the data available in other applications and use cases throughout your enterprise. We'll be doing a panel discussion up front, followed by a Q&A. So please make sure to hang around afterwards and ask any specific questions that you would like. We've got a great panel of experts here, so make sure and take advantage of that. Afterwards, we will post the video on YouTube, as well as we have a white paper that accompanies this. So if you watch your emails, that'll show up about a week after. All right, so now to introduce the panel, I'm Paul Williams, Vice President of Solutions for Kodiak Government Services. I'm going to do a round robin and let our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Alex Burkhart.
Thank you, Paul. I'm Alex Burkhart. I'm Operating Group President, and I lead cybersecurity for KGS.
And
Yep,
my name's
and we also have some special guests from industry, the first being Ed from Cribble. Ed?
Hi, how are y'all doing? Really thrilled to be here. My name's Ed Bailey. I work as a technical evangelism for Cribble. I was one of Cribble's first customers, and I'm always excited to talk to customers and prospects and help out with your SIM architecture.
All right, thanks, Ed. And I see that Brian's having some technical difficulties. Did you get those resolved?
Good.
All right. And then Brian Smitches from Amazon. Brian?
Thanks, Paul. Yep, I'm Brian Smitches, a federal partner solutions architect at AWS, and I get the privilege of working with Kodiak Government Services on all of their endeavors and with their customer engagements. So excited to talk to you today.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We're just going to jump right in. Alex, today we're going to talk about a use case that I think is applicable to, well, honestly, all of our federal clients, most federal organizations. We have implemented and managed many SIM implementations throughout the federal government, but you start doing it a new way. So you've got a different solution going forward, and it's been working really good for you. You mind talking about that for us?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Paul. So we had a interesting challenge, I guess. We were working with USAID, and they called us in to kind of modernize their SIM infrastructure. They had an infrastructure that had been in place for a while, but quite honestly wasn't being used very much. And things had kind of changed recently. The OPM had issued a memo, or OMB rather, M2131. And that was kind of the impetus for the modernization effort. That lays out a maturity model for log collection as well as log analysis. It kind of establishes log maturity levels EL 0, 1, 2, and 3, which includes both quantity of logs and quality. And it also requires that you add an additional technical capabilities to your SIM, an AI ML engine, orchestration, user-based analytics, which ties directly into insider threat, and full packet capture, so that to support the incident responders' ability to detect the adversary, find out what they're doing in the network, and get them out. So this was quite a significant challenge, especially for our customer. USAID is not the most resourced of agencies in the federal government. They have 87 offices around the world and about 14,000 employees. One thing that also made it very interesting, they have no legacy IT. They're 100% in the cloud, which is great, a huge AWS presence. They also have 75 other cloud service providers for different, software and as a service offerings, which makes pulling the logs and integration into a SIEM a very interesting endeavor. So we did kick it off. We started working with them through the EL levels, building out the additional capability. And, as with a lot of the OMB mandates, this one is unfunded. So there's no additional money that comes with it. So looking at that, we had about 10 terabytes of data a day that we needed to ingest, and we had the money for about 2 to 3. So that presented very interesting and difficult challenge, right? So typically, when you're trying to address these data ingest challenges in your SIEM, it's an analysis of what's important. The question that we always get asked: what's the security important data? What's the security relevant data? Well, unfortunately, the adversary doesn't plant a flag and let you know what they're going to break into ahead of time and what you're going to need to investigate it. So even if you have 80% of what the investigators need, it's always that last little bit, and you always end up being the bad guy in the investigation. It's kind of like the network, right? Everybody always blames the network, regardless of what the problem is. Well, you will always end up being the bad guy because you don't have that, extra 2% of what's needed to get the job done. So we started looking at alternative technologies, and we partnered up with Cribble. It provided a fantastic way to do data pre-processing. So instead of trying to shove 10 terabytes of data into our SIEM and pay for a license that we couldn't afford, we run the data through Cribble ahead of time. We put the security relevant data into the SIEM, but we put all of the data directly into S3 at the same time. And this was revolutionary for a number of reasons. First off, we were able to hit, EL3 in terms of log maturity. We were one of only 3 agencies in the federal government to hit that mandate. But we were able to do it and put the majority of our logs into S3 that weren't security relevant, and which solves that challenge of when there's an incident. First of all, we're meeting the requirement to keep the data and make it available online. But also, when there's that security incident and those investigators are looking into it and they find something they don't have, we're no longer the bad guys because we didn't capture it. We have the data. We can replay it through Cribble and get it back into the system. And one thing that ended up being really powerful. So previously, even if we had the data and it was past 90 days, so we would have to go into Glacier. We'd have to pull data out of cold storage. And because of how the encryption keys were rotated, we would have to build an entirely new SIEM infrastructure, work with our AWS engineers to pull the data out of Glacier, re-ingest it all back into Splunk on the new infrastructure, and it on average was about $170,000 in about 4 weeks and about 4 FTEs worth of time before we could even give the data to the incident responders to start their investigation of what happened before 90 days. That's gone now. Through replay, we can literally use Cribble to search the data in S3. I can find that needle in a stack of needles, and I can just replay back into the SIEM what the incident responders need. So I'm getting them the information they need to investigate that incident in, 15 minutes to an hour versus 3 weeks, and I'm not having to pay for all the extra infrastructure. So it's really been a fantastic solution.
You can ask a question. Could you, for the class, could you share what replay is and go through the steps? So, because I think that's a great point, but it just made me need a little bit help to understand what it is.
Yeah, but I can start, and I'd love to get your help, Ed, because I'm sure you know the technology much better than I do. But it's fantastic because what it does is it kind of gives us the ability to search through the data in S3 and then we can find what we need in terms of data that the incident responders need. And then we can take that data out of S3, push it back through Cribble, and put it into our SIEM so that the SIEM can log it, ingest it, and it can be searchable by our incident responders. So it lets us get the information we need and put it into the SIEM versus, kind of how we had to do it before, which was literally everything for the whole day and replaying a large amount of information that we just didn't need.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, that ability to pick even one event. Like previously, you're dealing with bucket format, so you're having to restore whole buckets of data. And with this, you can visually look through and find the one event you need or 10 million events you need and redirect that back to your SIM. And so I think that flexibility is really key. That's another thing when you're trying to do a restore with Splunk, you have no way to know where exactly that data is in which bucket. And so you have to hunt and find and restore a lot of data to get there.
100%. And that's, Paul, that reminded me of one thing that I didn't cover. So I said, we're able to put the security relevant data into the SIM, right? And, everyone loves numbers, and kind of looking for the government at what we saved. We were able to save them over $2 million a year in license and infrastructure costs by changing our architecture and doing the data pre-processing ahead of time.
Yeah, and
And able to improve the data, right? So
And
improve
able
the
to
amount of
improve
data.
access to the data, 100%.
And could you share what you mean by security relevant data? Because I think that's an important topic. A lot of times people aren't really classifying their data as it's coming in. So how did you determine what was security relevant right now versus what you might need in the future?
So it's a complicated process, but it's largely looking at the information and what are we going to need to identify a threat from an adversary. What are we going to need for an investigation? And some of that too is, what are we going to need now in 90% of the situations for those investigations? Because you can always make an argument that you're going to need all kinds of things for the investigation. So there is certainly a risk decision, right, in terms of what is priority to ingest and what's going to create those security alerts for my SIEM folks or for my incident responders to be able to start looking at, versus what's something that they might use 1 out of 100 times. So it's certainly, kind of what's involved in that investigation in terms of generating the alert and doing the deep dive, and then knowing that I always still have it in S3 and I can replay it if it's that 1 in 100 times that they need it.
Yeah, I think that's the key because you have in your object storage, you never have to say you're sorry. You know you got it. If you have to make another decision about what's security relevant, you can always undo it. And so I think that's really, really, really important because a lot of teams don't really go to because it does take some time to classify your data to understand what's for detection, what's for that immediacy, or what's versus what might be important in the future.
Yeah, and I think, kind of our MTIPS logs are a great example, because, external firewalls and that first layer of security, you're getting hit by all kinds of things. There's very little value in flooding your SIEM with, with all that stuff that's being blocked. But in terms of, investigation and larger picture analysis, there could be value in it. To see that you're getting hit by one adversary or another, depending on what threat intelligence that you receive. So, or DHCP logs, and external DNS resolution. There's a lot of very heavy logs in terms of volume that aren't necessarily going to be used on a daily basis.
So, Alex, you mentioned M2131 and something about EL3. Can you elaborate what you meant by EL3 and being able to achieve that?
Yeah, absolutely. So OMB set up these maturity levels, and those levels they kind of took all of the operating system and security logs and application logs and broke them up into maturity levels. So EL1, for instance, and I don't have it right in front of me, but EL1 may be basic operating system logs, and then you're getting more in depth while you're looking at authentication logs and application logs, and it just goes into the depth of what you need to capture in terms of being able to do a complete investigation. And so when you're walking through the ingestion from an application and from a cloud service provider, you're providing them the requirements of what they have to find and send you. And those requirements are identified based on those maturity levels. So OMB set deadlines that agencies had to hit for when they hit each of the maturity levels. And most of the agencies haven't gotten there because it's expensive and it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. But as I said, we were one of only 3 that made the EL3 deadline.
It was a great
And of course
accomplishment.
the EL1 and EL2 as well.
Thank you. So we're getting a couple of questions in the chat. I want to switch gears just a little bit for the purpose of addressing the questions, and also move on to Ed a little bit. So Ed's representing Cribble. Ed, can you just give us an overview of Cribble really quickly, the solution? I know we've already seen one question about can you deploy it in your cloud, or is it a SaaS offering? So I'll let you
Sure, and
get
thank
that
you.
one.
So Cribble offers a suite of tools, but I think the tool that we're going to focus on is called Cribble Stream. And the idea with Cribble Stream is it sits in the middle between your sources and destinations. I was one of the first customers for Cribble, and it was a huge benefit for me because I didn't have to rip out all my agents. I had 50,000 agents installed, and I didn't have to rip out those agents. I was able to put Stream in place, and over time, repoint my agents to Cribble Stream. So now I could have control over the data that I collected. I could remove data that I didn't need. I could transform formats. For example, it was amazing to be able to take very verbose sysmon and Windows event logging that was in XML, turn it into short JSON. So now the data is better, it's better formatted, and it's also 30% smaller. And Stream gives you the options to transform your data, make your data smaller, and then also route your data. Like Alex was mentioning, we early on decoupled our retention from Splunk and saved an enormous amount of money. So now we're putting all of our information into a vendor neutral format and object storage. And now I can reuse that data all over the place, not just back in Splunk, but we would put that data in Elastic, we put it in data warehouses. So we're able to share the data everywhere while still having controls around it and saving money at the same time. So that was a big thing that attracted me when I was a customer, was that flexibility to get what I needed to do to solve my problems. Like Alex mentioned, having 10 terabytes of data and 2 terabytes of capacity is something everyone has to do, and that's a thorny problem. It's like, it seems like an intractable problem. But having something like with Stream, you're actually able to do that. You're able to meet your requirements for protection and response, but also have a place to not have to lose data. Because previous to Cribble was constantly having to say, what are we going to risk dropping? And that was always a question. It's just like Alex said, that data that you drop, that's the data that you're going to need. It's just inevitable. So being able to navigate the risk and the cost questions and improve your data was something that I thought that was just really impactful about Cribble Stream.
So how easy is it to switch out to your solution? I know that we've talked a little bit about this, but maybe you can describe what the process would be if you're going to start adopting it.
The
Like,
first
what's
thing
the
I
impact to
recommend.
your teams?
Well, and that was the thing. So we did have a little bit of parallel work, but just for example, we were spending from a unit of work exercise, typically about 4 to 6 weeks for every custom integration and log onboarding. Post Cribble, so about 6 months into Cribble, we were able to switch over to 2-week sprints. So now we were able to get the same amount of work done in a half or to a third of the time. And so from a workflow standpoint, we started with a small use case. We cut over our syslog to Cribble, and then we cut over our endpoints to Cribble. Then we cut our Linux, and then our Windows servers. And so it took, in a 40 terabyte a day environment, about 50,000 agents, it took about 9 to 10 months, but we were able to see dramatic reductions. So previously, our data volumes were growing 28-30% a year. My costs were growing 28 to 30% as well. A year into Cribble, we were able to get down to 8% growth. And so we were able to handle the data growth because we were parking the vast majority of that data in object storage, and we were able to not have to buy million plus dollars of our SIM every year. We just didn't have to do that anymore. So we were able to manage our cost, get better data, and now shift my teams who were spending all their time keeping the SIM working, keeping data keeping data flowing. Now we were able to shift to better usage from our SIM because we were spending so much less time on admin tasks. Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. And so have you seen use cases where people were sending data to other tools?
All the time. And it's a real issue without Cribble because typically what you're having to do is come up with some herky-jerky ways of moving data around, or you'd have to install multiple agents handling the same data. And so it's awkward, hard to manage, and expensive. And so being able to produce an event one time and be able to say, I'm going to put that event first in, I'm going to put it in my object storage for retention. Second, I'm going to put it in my SIM. Third, I'm going to put it in my UBA platform for insider threat. And fourth, I'm going to put it into my data lake like a Snowflake or a Databricks for analysis. And now you see customers really just start expanding what they're doing with their data and getting more value with a lot less work.
Oh, that's great. I came up with a developer background instead of security or ops. Learned how to do the other stuff later in my career. And one of the things as a developer is that I always found a challenge is like they didn't want to give me access to the SIM, right? So they would I would have to just go manually pour through logs using Linux command tools, right, to try to find where things went wrong. But having that log data available and tools for like developers and operations folks and even marketing, like so being able to find out where traffic
So
might be
one thing I would
going on a
add,
website.
it's real common. The most common pattern is we started in security, but then we started expanding to support DevOps teams, operations teams.
Yeah.
Because so much data is shared. So, for example, you could take that stream of firewall data and you're putting all the firewall data over into an Elastic instance in order to support the network team, but you're still taking that same data, reformatting it, and putting it in your SIM. So now you're supporting both teams and you're still simplifying the environment. Because think about normally what firewall teams will do is they'll set up a second logger coming off their firewall in order to support their needs. So that creates double the impact on the network, double the impact on the firewall. And so just by being able to simplify, you can help manage data across your enterprise.
So one more question on that, and then I'll move over to Brian. But if you were going to say move SIMs or upgrade to another one, this seems like this would make it really easy
Yeah,
as far as
that's
the data goes.
I mean, it's both everyone. I mean, it's not uncommon to say I'm not pleased or I even hate my SIM. But a big emphasis is the amount of work and also the risk. I had a CISO one time tell me that I'm not pleased with our SIM, but I'm concerned that we're going to harm our posture while we move because we're going to lose our focus on our day-to-day security. And we did a POC and we were able to show how we were able to take their entire production data set and send it to their old SIM and also then clone that data set and send it to their new SIM. So their old SIM is functioning as designed. It's getting all of its data. It's in the right format. Then they're able to take all their content and detections, put it in their new SIM, and then compare it. They love the ability to say, is our new SIM catching all the same alerts, is all the same visibility as our, so that way they knew that the new product was just as good as the old product. They even left their old SIM going for 60 days after they cut over to the new SIM, just to say, what did we miss? And that level of security, it was very important. So not only did it make the migration easier and simpler, but it's just the level of risk. The system was like, you know what? I know we got this. I don't have to worry about our posture. And that gave them that feeling of flexibility and freedom that they had never experienced before.
Oh, that sounds good. Okay. Thank you, Ed. I am now going to turn to Brian. And Brian, we've talked a lot about SIMs, but let's focus a little bit about the art of the possible. If you're able to get this data freed up to put in other use cases and applications, what kind of things can you think of that AWS platform might be able to provide?
Yeah, so I'll address that, but I want to re-emphasize something that's been stated, which is that when you're sending your logs to a central heart, which is your Cribble stream, and then you get access to that data because it's not all getting sent to the SIM and then being transformed once it's in the SIM to where it's inaccessible. When you keep it in its native format, it means that you have the source data centralized somewhere where it can become accessible. And in this case, we've talked about Amazon S3 object storage. And so having all of your data that different various teams may need to access, with Cribble being able to route that data into the right systems, gives your ability to bring that data to the tooling of your choice, which is exactly the approach that both AWS and Cribble have taken of, we want you to choose the right tool for the job, right? So Cribble is getting the data to the right home. And then with AWS, we have some native products to where you can query your data in place when you're working with Amazon S3. So we have a product called Amazon Athena, where you're able to write SQL queries and that data is queried in place. That data that's in S3 can be integrated with third-party softwares. You can have your data lake running in S3 as the storage layer, but then you have another software access layer that comes from another third-party ISV, right? So all of these different patterns and paradigms where even if you wanted to go to a structured data warehouse, put the data into an Amazon Redshift cluster, then we can route that data through Cribble, get it in the right tools for the analysis, for the after it's in the right systems, we can have it in either its native format or its new format that will make it more valuable to the end users wherever they are. So the idea is just, again, making it more accessible and more flexible for the same amount of cost of storage on the underlying raw data.
Well said. And what about Amazon Security Lake? Because I think that's another really, really important tool that we're seeing security practitioners start to use.
Yeah, so Security Lake is, of course, going to continue to garner more adoption. It's about orchestrating and having all of these tools standardized on a format, right? And so where it becomes accessible, you know the questions you want to ask. Getting the data into a security lake where you have your observability and your security data, providing you actual information, yielding actual value is immensely critical for all these enterprises that are already operating their SIMs. They're having a bunch of different systems that they have to manage. We want you to have some degree of centralization because it's necessary from a management perspective. Otherwise, you have too much sprawl.
All right. Thank you for that. So now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience as well as any of our presenters if you have further clarifying points or questions that you would like to state.
So Edward Thomas has a question in the chat that I'd like to answer if possible.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I had a question about best practices for scaling SIM solutions as data volume grow. And so Edward, this is just take the vendor aspect out of it, that's the reason why I recommend having that intermediate layer as that buffer to handle your data as it grows, as your sites grow, so think of it, you have that wall at the shore to handle that tidal wave as it's coming at you, to give you that ability to buffer, to be able to help manage that data. Cribble's a great solution there, and this is something we routinely do because I see have it just massive. The amount of data is just growing like crazy, and so from an architectural standpoint, having that central ability in the middle gives you options to scale, gives you options to diversify your data, and meet the resiliency requirements that I think are incredibly important.
And so, Ed, to that point, where data volume is growing, what is the cost difference in storing data if you were to choose to send all your data to the SIM and grow the capacity to be able to handle all of it versus using that object storage layer in the middle? Is there a rough percentage difference in the cost of storage for that data?
So Alex probably has the exact data, but I see typically costs are going to run you, if you combine storage and license together, it's going to cost you in the area of 90 cents to about $1.10 a gig to put that data into your SIM versus putting it in S3 is going to cost you a penny to 2 pennies. So it's a material difference. I mean, Alex, I mean, from your experience, is that kind of that range of magnitude make sense?
Yeah, we were looking at roughly $1 million per additional terabyte a day in terms of storage and infrastructure costs.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that adds up fast. So Brad
Yeah.
Poole has a question about how can you reduce 10 gigs of data down to 2. Alex, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So um, we didn't reduce, so the total data volume, didn't go away, right? It was a matter of what we did with that data. So all of the information comes into Cribble, and all of the information is stored in S3. So I think that's important because we're retaining it, and you never know what you're going to need or what your incident responders are going to need for a security investigation. You have a requirement to retain all of those logs from M2131. So we're meeting that requirement. Um, but we're only ingesting into our SIM the information that is relevant and going to be integral in terms of creating those security alerts and providing that 80% solution for what the incident responders and the SOC are going to need on a daily basis to do those triage and investigations. So we're absolutely retaining all of the information. It's all getting pumped into S3. But the two terabytes was a small sub portion of that that's going to be immediately security relevant.
So, Alex, it makes sense when you classify a whole log or a log stream, a log source, as being something that needs to be hot and in the SIM versus something that can be warm and stored, or even cold. But what about what's inside the log? Do you transform what's inside of the log inside of Cribble, or do you just send it in its format and then transform that in the SIM to the format it needs to be?
That's a great question, Brian. And I think that's critical. So we absolutely do the transformation within each source, and then we decide what of that log source is going to be ingested in the SIM and what's going to go directly to S3. So as an example, Windows generates a ton of logs, right? And there's a lot of value in those logs, but they're not all immediately security relevant. So I'm going to take events like logins, like firewall hits, privilege escalation, different things like that from our Windows logs, and I'm going to put those in the SIM, and I'm going to take the rest of the data and put it directly in S3. So we definitely do that, more in-depth analysis and segregation inside of a log source as to what's going to go in the SIEM and what's going to just be stored in S3 in case we need it later.
And just to add on top of that, that's why I think it's so important. You have a combination of making choices, but also then transforming the data, like I mentioned with XML data. Also there's Lambda data has a lot of Lambda logs, for example, will have duplicate headers and duplicate fields. And so one of the common patterns we have is to say, okay, if we have duplicate data, we're going to make sure you only get the data once in every event. And so it's a way to make the data smaller, more compact, but you're not actually losing anything. All the data is still there. You're just changing the form of it. Typically, we see about a 30% reduction with this type of approach. And so it's great because typically it's gonna search faster, it's gonna have less data for storage. So just a range of benefit.
So it's a
Say
30% reduction in the data in the SIM is what you're saying. 30%
Right.
reduction where?
Without having actually drop, you're not losing a field. And I think
Right.
that's key. So
So
even
like
even with security relevant data, you make it smaller.
Mm-hmm.
in one log, you're taking the full data of the log and making that data unit smaller while it encapsulates still the full totality of the information.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
That adds
Lambda,
up.
perfect example. So Lambda has a duplicate header. So we have a by default, but you enable a function, it'll recognize the duplicate header and take it out.
I'd say another good example, I think, is DNS logs. Because DNS hierarchy, the way it works is you make a request and it goes to your next hop, which is usually a domain controller, and then the next hop, and then it eventually gets out of your network and goes and asks the root DNS server, right? So when you're looking at your DNS logs without any filtering or consolidation, I'm going to see the request that comes from my workstation, and I'm probably going to see it again from about 4 or 5 other servers, network gear, firewalls. It's all the same request. It's all the same source and destination. There's no value in recording the exact same information 8, 10 times, and then it comes back in, and again, you're getting it over and over and over again. So being able to do that consolidation, because all I care about is where's it coming from and who they're asking for and what the answer is.
That's a perfect example, and that ability to narrow that information down. PowerShell is another one. You'll typically see script blocks, you'll see notes, you'll see all sorts of data in PowerShell requests that aren't particularly useful. So that ability to identify repeating script blocks, the ability to identify we don't need this, so we're going to put this in object storage, but we're going to put this in our SIM. So this gives you so much more flexibility with your data.
So I have one more question for Ed, which is that I would imagine for the audience, they're evaluating, okay, do I want to explore Cribble? And if Cribble is going to add to my environment, that has a cost. Of course, it has value because we're reducing maybe what storage ends up in another more expensive area. But Ed, can you elaborate more on the pricing model for the Cribble offering? I know you mentioned that there's a cloud-based product and then a hosted one, as well as, I guess, the level of effort to incorporate
Thank you for your time.
Cool. Thank you.